3. The Curse of the Bell Witch, Tennessee. The tale of the Bell Witch is one of America's oldest and most chilling legends. In the early 1800s, the Bell family of Adams, Tennessee, became the center of a series of terrifying and unexplainable events. It started with strange sounds and eerie apparitions, but it soon escalated into violent hauntings, drawing the attention of the entire town. John Bell, the family patriarch, was a respected farmer who had never believed in the supernatural. But as the weeks passed, he could no longer deny that something sinister had taken hold of his family. It started small, faint scratching sounds on the walls, soft knocking that seemed to echo through the house at odd hours. But as the nights went on, the sounds grew louder, more insistent, filling every room with an oppressive tension. Then came the voice, a low, whispering voice that seemed to float through the air as if someone unseen was speaking just inches from their ears. It was a woman's voice, laced with malice, filled with an anger that was as incomprehensible as it was terrifying. She called herself Kate and claimed to be the spirit of a woman who had been wronged by the Bell family. But she never explained her grudge, never gave a reason for her hatred. She simply tormented them night after night. The Bell's daughter Betsy suffered the worst of the attacks. Kate seemed particularly drawn to her, tormenting her with a cruelty that bordered on sadistic. She would slap Betsy's face, pull her hair, and even leave bruises on her arms. Betsy would wake up screaming, her body trembling, her skin covered in scratches that she could not explain. Her nights were filled with terror, each one worse than the last, as Kate's haunting grew more violent with every passing day. But John Bell himself was not spared. Kate seemed to take a perverse pleasure in watching him suffer, taunting him with whispered threats and cruel laughter. He would often wake in the dead of night, feeling an invisible weight pressing down on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. It was as if Kate was trying to choke the life out of him, her hatred seeping into his very soul. He began to wither, his health deteriorating as Kate's curse took its toll. One night, during a violent thunderstorm, Betsy was dragged from her bed by unseen hands, her body lifted off the ground and flung across the room. She screamed, her voice filled with a terror that echoed through the house. Her family rushed to her side, but they could do nothing to help her. She lay there, her body trembling, her face pale, as Kate's mocking laughter filled the room. John Bell's health continued to decline, and he became a shadow of his former self. He was plagued by nightmares, haunted by visions of a woman with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. The night before he died, he heard her voice, a cold whisper that sent a chill through his bones. "I will take you with me," she said, her words dripping with venom. The following morning, the family found him dead in his bed, his face contorted in terror. By his side was a small vial of a strange, dark liquid, poison, though no one knew where it had come from or how it had ended up in his room. Some say Kate herself had left it as a final act of vengeance, her wrath unending even in death. To this day, the Bell Witch remains a mystery, her curse lingering over the land where the Bell family once lived. Visitors to Adams, Tennessee, often report strange occurrences, a cold breeze on a still day, the faint sound of laughter carried on the wind, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Some say Kate's spirit still roams the land, her hatred eternal, her thirst for revenge unquenched. And for those who dare to visit, they are left with a chilling reminder of the curse that claimed John Bell's life, a curse that may never be lifted. 1. The Eternal Spirit of Pittock Mansion. The Pittock Mansion in Portland, Oregon, is a place of elegance with its European architecture, sweeping views of the city below, and grand halls lined with antique furnishings. Built in 1914 by the wealthy publishing mogul Henry Pittock and his wife, Georgiana, the mansion was meant to be a sanctuary, a place to spend their golden years. but fate had other plans. Within just 5 years of its completion, Henry and Georgiana had both passed away, leaving the mansion steeped in sorrow. Today, many say they never truly left. Linda, a caretaker at the mansion, had heard the stories of paranormal activity, but she brushed them off as mere local legend. She'd spent plenty of quiet nights in the mansion, without so much as a shiver of fear. But one evening, as she was locking up after a long day of guiding tourists, she sensed something different in the air, a tension that was both strange and foreboding. Shadows seemed to stretch along the walls, flickering as if alive, and an eerie quiet blanketed the halls. As Linda moved through the mansion, she noticed a sweet, overpowering scent of roses lingering in the air, as if someone had doused the room in perfume. Georgiana Pittock was said to love roses, a flower she had often kept in the mansion's garden. The scent was unmistakable, almost as if Georgiana herself was walking the halls. Trying to dismiss her nerves, Linda made her way toward the main parlor to check the last of the doors. But then she felt a chill, a sudden drop in temperature that made her shiver and her breath fog in the air. Turning toward the hallway, she saw something, a figure standing in the dim light at the end of the corridor. The woman was dressed in a long, old-fashioned gown, her shoulders draped in lace, and her hair pinned up in a style that hadn't been worn in decades. She stood motionless, facing away from Linda, her head tilted slightly down as if deep in thought. Linda froze, her heart pounding as the figure slowly turned, just enough for her to catch the glint of sorrowful eyes peering from a ghostly, pale face. "Hello?" Linda's voice was barely a whisper, her throat tight with fear. The figure's expression remained blank, but then her mouth opened as if to speak. A voice, soft, cold, like a faint whisper, drifted through the air, tinged with an aching loneliness. "Don't leave me here alone." The words hung heavy, and Linda's legs felt as though they'd turned to stone. She couldn't look away from the spirit's haunting, hollow eyes, drawn in by an almost hypnotic pull. The figure seemed to shimmer, her outline fading like mist, but her presence lingered. In that moment, Linda felt an overwhelming sadness, as though the sorrow of years gone by had seeped into her very bones. 2. Echoes, in the Stanley Hotel, Colorado. Perched high in the Rocky Mountains, the Stanley Hotel is a place of strange beauty, where the crisp mountain air and picturesque views mask a darker legacy. Since it opened in 1909, stories of hauntings have swirled around the hotel, but none are as unnerving as the tales of Room 217. It's the room where famed horror author Stephen King once stayed, a night so unsettling that it inspired The Shining. But King wasn't the first to feel the icy grip of terror there. Generations before, the room bore witness to a far more sinister encounter. In the late 1970s, a young couple named Mary and Tom decided to stay at the Stanley for a long weekend. They'd heard about the hotel's haunted reputation, but they laughed it off, eager for a quiet escape. The afternoon they arrived, they took in the scenery, hiking around the lush grounds and marveling at the Rockies towering above. By evening, they were exhausted but exhilarated, ready for a restful night. The room was warm and inviting, decorated in soft creams and deep reds that seemed to embrace them as they entered. Mary threw herself onto the bed with a laugh, feeling the old mattress bounce beneath her. As she closed her eyes, she could almost imagine what it must have been like a century ago. Guests in grand clothes walking the halls, the clink of champagne glasses in the ballroom below. Tom unpacked their things, and they settled in, soon falling into a peaceful slumber. But just as the clock struck midnight, Mary was jolted awake. The room had become unnaturally cold, and she could see her breath fogging in the air. She nudged Tom awake, but he only groaned and rolled over. Frowning, she sat up and looked around, expecting to see the draft of an open window, but everything was shut tight. Then she noticed it, a faint, steady humming sound coming from somewhere nearby. It was low and eerie, vibrating through the walls, like an old radiator coming to life, or a voice, deep and mournful. Mary tried to ignore it, but it seemed to grow louder, filling the room with a strange, almost tangible tension. She looked around, her eyes straining in the darkness. That's when she saw her, standing in the doorway, just on the edge of the shadows. It was the silhouette of a woman, her hair pinned up in an old-fashioned style, her dress flowing around her like mist. She was faint, almost transparent, but her eyes shone with an unnatural brightness. The woman simply stood there watching, her gaze empty, yet piercing, as if she could see into Mary's very soul. Terrified, Mary shook Tom awake again, her voice a harsh whisper. "Tom, there's someone here." His eyes flew open, and he stared at the figure, his face draining of color. They watched, frozen in horror, as the woman began to move, gliding slowly into the room. Her feet made no sound as they skimmed the carpet, and her form seemed to waver like a mirage in a desert. She stopped at the foot of their bed, her gaze fixed on them with an intensity that made Mary's heart pound. The woman's lips parted, and she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you here?" Her tone was sorrowful, almost pleading, and a chill ran down Mary's spine. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The woman's eyes narrowed, and her face twisted into a look of pure anguish, her mouth opening in a silent scream. The room grew colder, and Mary felt a weight pressing down on her chest, like invisible hands squeezing the air from her lungs. Suddenly, the lamps flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The woman's form began to flicker as well, her outline growing faint, then sharp, then faint again, as if she was struggling to remain in this world. She lifted a hand, reaching out toward Mary, and a wave of sadness washed over her, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "Please, leave me be." The woman's voice was barely audible now, filled with a longing so deep it was almost tangible. Then, with a final flicker, the woman vanished, her form dissolving into the air. The room was silent, the cold gone as quickly as it had come. Tom and Mary sat in stunned silence, their hands clasped tightly together. Neither spoke, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The rest of the night passed in a haze of sleeplessness, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind sending a fresh wave of terror through them. The next morning, they recounted their experience to the hotel staff, expecting disbelief or laughter. Instead, the staff merely nodded, their faces grave. "Room 217 has a history," one of them said quietly. "Elizabeth Wilson was a chambermaid here once, back in 1911. She survived an explosion in that very room, but some say part of her never left." Thank you for listening to Hello, It's Me Ghost, where the spookiest, most bone-chilling stories come to life. If you enjoyed these tales, make sure to hit the subscribe button, give us a rating, and share with friends who might enjoy a haunting too. Until next time, keep your lights on and your ears open for any echoes from the past.